Sputnik, of course, is the classic one. I mean, it was a beeping aluminum grapefruit, but we ripped up our entire educational and scientific system and coasted on the benefits of that revolution for 60 years. We tend to overreact, but it also means we overreact in our fixing of what we perceive the problem to be. And that tends to define global affairs for decades at a time. We've got three things that are going on that honestly were bipartisan, both Trump and Biden. And I know that's like, shh, don't say that too loud. But they, in terms of foreign policy and especially foreign economic policy, they are almost identical. Number one, we will never end the tariff system that we have against the Chinese. That is populist more than it is nationalist, more than it is economic, but it still has the same effect. So China is no longer a trusted partner. Number two, the United States is changing its military disposition. And it's not so much that we're moving forces to Asia, it's that we're moving forces away from the position where they could actually support Chinese trade. Now, I've always been of the feeling that when your country bases its existence on the Americans' willingness to bleed and die to protect your ability to get energy and food and challenge the Americans, that you have a problem with your national thinking. But we're seeing that all break it apart right now, and the Russian war is the first phase of that. Third, there's a concern that China's not going to last long enough to be a full boogeyman. The demographic collapse there is so far advanced, and the Chinese are starting to release bits and pieces of their 2020 census, which suggests that they've overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, all of whom would have been born after 1980, and most of whom would have been women, which suggests that the Chinese population will shrink by half by just 2050. And if that proves true, China doesn't survive this decade. We'll have to find somebody else to freak about. I can see the logic of that, because if it's a purely nationalist question, having something to rally around certainly would help the CCP survive what is going to be a traumatic deindustrialization process. I mean, you can't lose half the population of your country and not have a political challenge. I mean, that'd be kind of silly. And so before the Ukraine war, I was thinking kind of a 1 in 3 chance that this was going to happen. I've reevaluated that. The Ukraine war has been kind of a testing ground for Chinese theories on how the world works. And the Chinese have always looked to the Russians as an example, not necessarily to follow, but something to learn from. So when the Soviet system collapsed, they're like, okay, we are not going to do some sort of perestroika. We're going to keep the lockdown. And because of that, China still exists today. But the assumptions that China has made have all been proven false. So the idea was that the war would be quick. And in Ukraine, that's clearly not going to be the case. And Taiwan's been preparing for their war with the Chinese for 10 times as long as the Russians have been preparing for their war with the Ukrainians, not to mention that Taiwan has a moat. So the idea that this would be a quick and easy fight, that's gone away. The idea that no one would intervene militarily has been proven hilariously wrong. The idea that the world would just suck it up because Russia is an important country and everyone needs food and energy, that's been proven false. And if you take the sanctions that have been put against the Russians and you put them against the Chinese, oh, dear God, you would crash the system in less than a year. You would have famine in 6 months. The trains would stop running in 3. It would be a catastrophe. But I think what has really terrified Xi the most is the boycotts. The idea that like individual people can have an influence on large-scale corporate policy, that is so foreign to the CCP's experience. They don't even know how to process that. So every assumption they've made has been proven wrong in the first month of the war. And normally, this would be the part where you take your smart people and you put them in the back room with some pizza and some beer and have them come up with a plan B. But Xi's cult of personality is now so all-encompassing that he's killed all the smart people. So there's no one left. It's just Xi. It's just the ideology. It's just the propaganda. And China is slamming its head into the wall over and over and over until something cracks. And we're seeing cracks throughout the entire system today. Their mismanagement of COVID is just one example. I'd argue it's a 50-50 split, and I think you're thinking the right way. Cornered powers tend to lash out if they can. Declining powers who are incapable of reaching what they need with military means tend to just die. So the Soviet collapse is probably the best example of the peaceful approach. And I broadly think that some version of that is going to happen to China. I mean, you never know. China's history is replete with how it can all go to hell in a short period of time. Not all of it's pretty. None of it's pretty. But there's nowhere for them to go. There's no place that they can go and invade that solves their problems. Even if they captured Taiwan, it's not like they would be part of the global trading system anymore, because they couldn't operate the semiconductor fabs themselves. If they could, they'd already have them. The United States and Japan does the designs for them. So Taiwan is a good nationalist chest-beating topic, but it actually doesn't achieve anything strategically anymore. They could go into Vietnam again, and when they went in 79, they got treated to the same gentle welcome that Americans did, but that doesn't solve any problems either. They can't get to India because of the Himalayas. They can't go to Russia because the Russians will nuke them. That just leaves Kazakhstan, which leaves me wondering what the winner gets. There's no war scenario here that helps China from a trade and energy, a food, or a manufacturing point of view. This is the end of China. This is the end of the Han ethnicity. Now, that's not going to disintegrate completely in 10 years, but definitely this century. The population bust is so extreme and so far advanced, there is no way that the Han survive as an entity, much less remotely in their current borders by the end of the century.
That's what they say. Explain Han.
The CCP is now stationing agents in homes of Uyghurs, so that the wife and the husband don't have intercourse.
Right.
It is a flat-out genocide. There is no issue of re-education here. We've never seen this kind of population collapse. The Black Death, when it hit Europe, wiped out a third of the population. It took everybody 150 years to recover. Now, that set the stage for some positive things like the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, but in the meantime, it kind of sucked.
Yeah.
What we're seeing here is a population decline, not as quick as what happened with the Black Death, but far more holistic and without an obvious recovery. One of the things that we're dealing with in China and a lot of countries around the world is you can only have a large population structure with industrialized inputs, whether it's food or medicine or infrastructure. You take that away, and that is what is going away, and you have to revert to pre-industrial population patterns. Now, in any country, this is going to be a horrific challenge, but in China specifically, they industrialized so fast. Within 45, 50 years. So we have seen a complete scrubbing of the skill sets that are necessary to engage in large-scale pre-industrial agriculture. It's just not part of the skill set anymore. So if you then remove the industrial inputs, you're talking about population crashes from famine and decivilization at the same time. What emerges on the backside of that is an open question. Now, historically speaking, I think the most likely outcome here a decade from now is that the North will descend into kind of a neo-Maoist tyranny that makes the Cultural Revolution look like a picnic, where the population collapses are by far the most extreme. And the return from the emptying of the cities to the countrysides as people return to subsistence agriculture is the norm. So a completely pre-industrialized tyrannic society. And then separately, you will have the city-states from Shanghai down to Guangzhou. Historically, these cities have gotten the majority of their food from abroad. They partner with foreign companies and countries to get food and to get capital and to get technology, and then they process that with local labor and infrastructure to make products to participate in someone else's supply chain. And that has been the norm for those city-states for most of recorded history. The productivity stats that we're able to get out of China, and yes, I know Chinese statistics don't support that argument. They suggest that while total labor productivity has increased by a factor of 2 or 3 since 2000, total labor cost has increased by a factor of 22. So it's just not happening. Now the automation is required. The automation that is required to make this, to really move the needle, is expensive, and it doesn't come from very many places. The machinery that the Chinese make is very low end. So if you want to do textiles, it's probably okay for that, but you're not going to use it for automotive. For that, they have to import it either from the United States or from the Europeans, with the Germans generally being kind of the go-to country for everyone. They do the best machinery in the world. And then there's the problem that you still have to train the folks. And if they haven't moved up the value-added scale fast enough, then you have another problem. So I can see the Chinese being squeezed from both sides. There's also a third issue that is more relevant for most of the rest of the world as opposed to the Chinese. Machinery is expensive. Installing it is expensive. Building it is expensive. Retooling it constantly as the product evolves is expensive. And since we have this baby boomer cadre globally that is in the process of retiring right now, they're taking their investment capital with them. So anything you want to do that's